Here we have our unit nicely washed up and laid out, and I'm going to go ahead and start out with the K3 drum and sun gear. Now, on this particular unit, if these clutches had been damaged severely or burned, we would replace them with new ones. Okay, here we have the output Planetary assembly. This is the output shaft, and after I've carefully washed it, what I'm doing is just simply inspecting the threads. There, the pilot is in excellent condition. Make sure, of course, that my splines aren't damaged. This one's in excellent condition. Now, here I'm going to have a series of Torlon style sealing rings. I'm going to get brand new ones in the kit, and these are made out of a material called Torlon. They're very tough and they work very well. Now, I also have a radial style Torrington Bearing. This is going to fit here in this section of the shaft. We want to inspect it, make sure it's not damaged and hasn't scarred the inner race. It looks in excellent condition. Now, in my overhaul kit, I'm going to get brand new Torlon sealing rings, and I'll be installing the new ones. Now, at the same time here, part of this assembly, which we'll show in just a moment, is the K3 drum and sun gear. And here we see the piston, and I need to remove the O-ring. Now, one advantage of these mechanics gloves, even if there's a lot of transmission fluid there, they're actually textured, so it allows me to grip it and remove the O-ring. Now, if you're going to use a pick to pick up an O-ring or to try to remove a sealing ring, I strongly recommend that you use this style pick. It's actually made out of a tough nylon material, glass-filled nylon, and it is very strong, but it's not going to mar or scratch the aluminum or steel. So here we see the K3 drum piston. There's its outer sealing ring. These are actually its inner sealing rings, and again, because of the gloves, I can just simply pick up the O-ring and pop it right off. There it goes. Pick up the O-ring and just simply pop it right off. No problem. So not only do these gloves protect your hands, but also allow you to grip something that you normally wouldn't be able to do with your bare thumbs. All right, now as we look at this sun gear assembly, the sun gear looks to be in excellent condition. There, I don't see any deformity of the spline. That's very minor. And as I look at the output Planetary assembly, we want to make sure that the individual Planetary pinions are not scored or marred, and that they're all, as far as the series of needle bearings going against the shaft, it's very tight. Now, there is a certain amount of free play, axial free play, and that's acceptable, and that would be considered normal. Now, here with Mercedes, this is actually a section here that's directing lubricating oil to the hollow shaft that has a lubrication port to keep my needle bearings well lubricated. So even after 100,000 miles, this is in excellent condition, ready to go another 100,000 miles. Okay, here we've replaced the Torlon sealing rings on the output Planetary. This is going to be the Torrington Bearing race. We want to make sure that we tack that down with our assembly lube. Here we see the K3 drum and the K3 piston with its new double D O-ring, and then here we see the conventional O-rings. They're going to be the inside member that's going to seal. I'm going to use the assembly lube to carefully put the piston in. Then I'm going to install the diaphragm spring and the retainer. All right, here we see the diaphragm spring and the L-type retaining ring. That's going to retain this into the drum. All right, now Mercedes actually has a special tool to compress this diaphragm spring and to install the L-type retaining ring. I actually have one, I'm just too lazy to get it. I developed this a long time ago. This is just simply a plastic pipe that's split. It actually works extremely well. One reason why I like it is because it doesn't mar the metal at all. Now, I actually use an arbor press for all of my pressing operations. An arbor press is a gear type press that is actuated by hand, so you have direct feedback, and it's not designed for a lot of force, but it works very nicely when working with the different type of automatic transmission, diaphragm, and coil type springs. Now the trick is I need to press the diaphragm down and slip the retaining ring in position. And this actually works very, very nicely. Now what I've done is I have compressed the spring, and this is actually a copper alloy screwdriver. And you say, why in the world am I using that? Well, what it doesn't scratch metal. If you have steel, it's not going to mar or scratch the steel at all. If you have aluminum, well, obviously the aluminum's softer than the copper, but it's not so prone to mar it as steel would be. So I just simply push this into position and you'll hear it click. Okay, so here we see our L-type retaining ring, and it's retaining the diaphragm spring. It's forcing the piston into the retract position. It's nicely in position, ready to continue assembly. Now, here we see our Torrington race, and you want to make sure that this is tacked down nicely. Doesn't go anywhere, and we're ready to continue assembly. All right, now here we have the intermediate ring gear going against the output planetaries. And here we have the rear planetary assembly and the rear sun gear, and it's going to couple to the intermediate sun gear via the F2 Spragg, which we'll show in just a moment. Now what I've done is I've carefully retained the Torrington Bearing race, and here is its Torrington Bearing. It's retained. It can be easily popped out, but it's retained there in the aluminum housing. We'll go ahead and slip the internal gear. It's really not necessary to remove this, so that's not necessary at all. We did here in this case, but that's totally unnecessary. We're just doing it for inspection. Sometimes it requires just a little bit of coaxing to go down. There we go. And then here's its snap ring. One thing that's kind of a good idea is that you'll notice the paint pin marks. Some of these paint pin marks actually come from the factory, like this one right here. That's from Mercedes. Some of these other paint pin marks, that's me just simply marking components. I've got the race. There's the sun gear. There we go. Now I need to put together the F2 Spragg. Now, Mercedes has made several design changes. This is one of the later designs. You'll notice I actually have a type of ball bearing in there that's really not serviceable. As you can see, after it's installed, it's staked in position. I don't think I can punch that out easily, or maybe I'm wrong, but I haven't tried. Possibly you could. Okay, here we see the rear sun gear and the F2 Spragg. The later design actually uses a bearing that supports that sun gear on the intermediate sun gear, and it was unclear whether this could easily be removed. And it's a very light press fit. There's plenty of clearance. She slides right out. Now, just a word real quick. Oftentimes what we have found is it's very hard to buy hard part components, especially for Mercedes transmissions. And very easily, the cost of the hard parts can exceed the cost of a core. There are millions of the 722.6 out there, and many of them are now residing in the automotive recycling facilities. In other words, salvage yards, wrecking yards. Now, the only problem when you're purchasing a 722.6 core is they have about 3 different combinations of gear sets that kind of can be mixed and matched between vehicles, and they'll have a different planetary count between a V6 and a V8. Obviously, a V8 would have 4 planetaries, whereas the V6 only has 3. So you've got to be sensitive to that. Now, what happens is if I build up a unit and it has the wrong set of planetaries matched to the transmission control module, well, I get gear ratio error faults. And that's what happens. So normally what we try to do when we're rebuilding a Mercedes unit, we want the original unit so we can verify exactly what we're doing as far as the tooth count for the gears. But the answer to the question, does this bearing come out of the rear sun gear and F2 Spragg? Oh, yes, it does. A very light press fit. Not much, and I mean, I'm talking about real. I didn't hit this with a hammer. This is an arbor press. That way it keeps it nice and level and straight. Just slid right out. So there we see this bearing as a light slip, actually a press fit, very light press fit, almost a slip fit there into the rear sun gear. And this is also going to be the F2 Spragg. Okay, here we have the F2 Spragg. This one's in an excellent condition. I want to make sure that I don't allow the individual Spragg components to fall out. Now, there's really only one way that this can go in. If I put it in backwards, it's going to lock up backwards, and that's going to be a disaster. We don't want that. And here we see the brass retainer. If I try to put it in upside down, I won't be able to because the lower base there will prevent me from putting the retainer on. And then here we have the snap ring, and you want to be careful not to mar or lift up the race of the Torrington bearing. Now this is where the copper screwdriver comes into play, because you see I can reach up here. You see I'm not going to scratch anything, and just see, pick this up, move it right over, no scratch, no mar. Very nice. No problem. Okay, here we see our F2 Spragg. We'll go ahead and carefully assemble it. And of course I'm looking at it from the back, but as you can see it freewheels counterclockwise, or looking from the front, it would lock up counterclockwise, freewheel clockwise. And that's what I want. Now, it's impossible to install this upside down. On some applications or some transmissions, you can put a Spragg in upside down, then it locks backwards. And usually what happens is you get the unit all in the vehicle, get ready for the road test, and there it freewheels in first, and then as you shift to second, the unit locks up. So let's not do that. Always make sure that this Spragg is installed correctly. This one's in excellent condition. Okay, this is the K3 clutch. These clutches are in excellent condition, so they're going to be reused. Now, one of the things that Mercedes likes to do is they used a dish-type spring there that goes against, or plate, dish-type plate that goes against the diaphragm return spring. And of course you want to pay attention as to which way the dish goes. And I like to put a little mark on it, just let me know that that's up. But there we can see the dish. And then we're going to go ahead and start stacking our plates. Now, these plates, sometimes you hear the word single-sided. As you see, it's steel on one side, friction on the other. And this has become popular in the last 20 years. You see I have an external and then an internal. And then obviously I want a steel going against a friction. Now there's some wear on these plates, but they're certainly serviceable. So these will be used again. All the rubber has been freshened up. internal, external, internal, external. Now, the actual number of plates sometimes will vary between the V6s and the V8s, and obviously a V12. Higher torque applications will have a greater number of plates. Now, swapping the drum to increase the number of plates, that may not cause a gear ratio error, but it certainly would possibly affect the shift quality. Of course, the transmission control module is trying to constantly keep track and determine the rate that it needs to fill a clutch to apply it smoothly, and keeps track of that in its memory. Now, the question of which way does this plate go? Now, you'll notice the witness mark going up against the snap ring. Normally on Mercedes, they like to put the beveled part down against the clutch. As far as I can tell, this is a factory assembly. It's the first time this unit's been disturbed, but obviously this was installed in this way, going against the clutch. So I'll go ahead and put it back. And then here we see its snap ring. Now, of course, when I put this together, it's a good idea to take the rear sun gear and Spragg off the intermediate sun gear shaft and line everything up. This will make it a whole lot easier when you're putting it together. Okay, here we've gone through the output shaft, new Torrington sealing rings, checked our bearing, make sure our race is in position, inspected our Torrington bearings in the internal gear. We'll go ahead and gently set this in position. Now, what I'm ready to do now is, here we see the rear sun gear and the intermediate sun gear. This is all indexed correctly and put together, and the Spragg is turning in the correct direction. As you can see, the way this works is the Spragg will hold it in one direction, and if I want to prevent it from overrunning, I bring on the K3 drum. All right, now as we're going to assemble the intermediate and the rear sun gear and the K3 drum, first thing you want to do is take the rear sun gear and just set it down in the K3 drum to align the clutches. It'll make it much easier to assemble it. There we go. I've inspected the Spragg. I cannot put this in upside down on the Mercedes, at least this later type. On some transmissions you can, and that's going to be a real problem. So here we go. And as we look from the front of the transmission, it freewheels clockwise, locks counterclockwise, and that is correct. All right, now, here we have a snap ring, and the true arc snap ring is going to be tapered on one side. This looks like it's pretty well flat, but I can see from the witness mark how it actually was installed. Now what I'm going to do is simply use a pair of snap ring pliers and go ahead and install this snap ring using the paint pen. Confirms the original direction. Now keep in mind that oftentimes it doesn't really make any difference, and I want to be careful not to mess up my O-rings. I'm going to use my favorite copper screwdriver here. Carefully push this down into position. And there we go, nicely into the groove. So, we're ready to go. All right, here we go. We have our Torrington bearing in a race. There's our Torrington bearing in our intermediate internal gear. Here we see the intermediate sun gear and the rear sun gear and the rear planetaries. So we'll go ahead, and I've put a little bit of assembly lube right here to slip past my Torrington bearings and provide just a little lubricant here for the radial thrust bearing. Now, of course, before I do this, though, good idea to let's put it here together with the K3 drum. And best way to do that here Okay, so here we have the output shaft and planetary, intermediate internal gear, intermediate sun gear, and then what we have here, this is of course the rear planetaries and the rear sun gear and the K3 clutch. The K3 clutch, when I apply the K3 clutch, it creates a rigid connection between the intermediate and the rear sun gear. When the K3 clutch is released, the intermediate sun gear will lock to the rear sun gear only in one direction with the F2 Spragg. Now we're ready to go ahead and put in the Torrington bearing race. Here's the Torrington bearing. Just very gently slide that down on there. Whoop, there we go. Should just carefully, don't damage your Torrington sealing rings. If you had to take them off, you could, but I think I'll just slide it down nicely. There's my Torrington bearing. Here is my other race. You'll notice the paint mark just telling me the up direction, but there is a witness mark, so it'd be pretty obviously which side the rollers had been riding on. If I flipped it upside down, it'd be no big deal, but let's try and maintain that. And here we see our snap ring. And we can get the snap ring pliers and go ahead and install our snap ring. So here we go. Just simply slide it down very gently and be careful not to disturb our Torlon sealing rings. If there's any question, you can take them off. Okay, in an effort to not to mar our Torlon seals, which are of course brand new, I'm going to go ahead and just simply remove them, and then I just carefully push my retaining ring down into position. Be careful, we don't want to mar or scratch anything. And if you drop the clutch, or if you have a race that's missing on one of the Torrington bearings, you're either going to have an excessive gap or you won't be able to put the snap ring into position. So here we go. She's ready to go. There, I feel it. Feeling good. Freewheeling in one direction, locking in the other. We're done with this section. Let's not forget to put our Torlon sealing rings back into position. Be gentle. They're pretty tough, but I don't want to abuse them at all. As far as the orientation here, I don't think that makes any difference, but I kind of like to just, for artistic purposes, just simply line them up. Here we go. And normally the way this works is that these will actually spin with the outer tubular member, and sometimes you'll actually see a witness mark where it will wear a little bit there on the Torlon sealing ring where it makes contact with the steel shaft. Okay, now we're ready to rebuild our pump, and usually it's kind of standard procedure anytime you're rebuilding an automatic transmission. So let's go ahead and replace the front seal. Okay, here we see the front pump, and we have carefully replaced the front seal. We use the arbor press to press it in. We've replaced the O-ring. We've inspected the bushing. Normally we would replace the pump bushing, but this one is in excellent condition, and this was of course testified to the condition of the drive and driven gear. They're in excellent condition, and of course we notice the indicator of the up, facing up towards you, and of course a witness mark testifies to the position of the converter. So, and these were marked as we disassembled the pump. It's packed with assembly lube and with transmission fluid. Now on the actual pump cover, and this is the pump cover, this is the belt housing. This can actually be serviced separately. And to remove it, of course, I would be removing these small T30 Torx fasteners. A little coaxing, and it will come right off, and then I can replace this elastomer gasket. Now, normally this can be reused if it's in excellent condition, and this one is, so we're going to leave this one alone. Now, on this aluminum pump cover right here, this is a critical wear point, and this one's in excellent condition, so this is serviceable. We're going to use this. So now we're ready to assemble our pump. And I mean, this is really straightforward. I want to be careful that we have plenty of assembly lube. There's a nice beveled edge so that the O-ring will slip nicely into the pump cover. It's supported here on this piece of plastic pipe. Oftentimes what we can do is just use a long Phillips head screwdriver to align it correctly. So we'll go ahead and do that now. Okay, here we have our bolts for the pump, carefully installed, pulling the pump up tight. And we'll go ahead and torque these to about 18 foot-pounds. And you want a crisscross pattern. And then we're ready to continue on. Okay, here we have the pump assembled and our Torx fasteners, T45s, carefully threaded down and torqued. And of course we primed the pump and we actually tested on the converter. Now we're ready to move to the B2 brake. Now, the B2 brake piston is actually a molded piston, so there's not actually a separate seal to replace. It's actually part of the piston. Now this one's in excellent condition, nice and soft and pliable. Now keep in mind that the B1 brake is going to be applied to prevent the F1 Spragg from overrunning. And also in 5th gear, the B1 brake is going to be locking the front sun gear to the case for overdrive. Now what I've done is I've just simply lubricated this. There's not much to put it in, just want to be careful that don't fold it up or anything, and it works perfect. It's nice and smooth, no problem whatsoever. Alright, here I see it's a diaphragm spring, and here I see one of these L-type retaining rings. Now you could probably push it down, but that would be kind of hard to do and kind of difficult. So what I've done is this is my tool that I fabricated, and I believe this is actually a part from a 4L30E, old General Motors 4-speed automatic transmission. And this works very nicely to kind of compress the spring and gives me plenty of room to slip this snap ring in there. Now, how am I going to do that? I use my favorite portable spring compressor. Okay, what I've done is I've pushed down the diaphragm style spring. And again, as I mentioned, there is a tool set for working on this, and what I found here is that I kind of like mine, so that's kind of what I've done here. So I have my own custom set here, and what I'm going to do is just very carefully push this snap ring down by hand, and it will snap right into place. Okay, now see, I have carefully positioned my snap ring, and it's in the groove, and the spring is away from it, so it moves freely. And the idea is you want the notch here to be probably in one of these intermediate positions. And it's nicely in position here. So as I loosen my little retainer right here, this should pop right up into the groove of the snap ring. And there we go. That looks very nice. Okay, here we're ready to move to the K2 drum. Now, this is the front internal gear. You'll notice that the turbine shaft there is integral with the front internal gear. This is always driven by the turbine shaft. Here we see the K2 drum, and what happens when energized, it's going to connect the intermediate internal gear and the rear planetary assembly to the turbine shaft. Now, we've disassembled it, cleaned it, inspected it carefully. It's in excellent condition. Here we see its piston. Here's its diaphragm style return spring. Here we see the snap ring. Now, one thing that happens on the design of an automatic transmission, if I have a spinning clutch, if I have fluid here behind the piston, centrifugal force will have a tendency to force the fluid outward and partially apply the piston. So to counteract that, normally what I'll have is I'll have a chamber with an O-ring. The diaphragm spring is in here, and as the clutch spins, I have centrifugal force on fluid on this side, and this is usually pressurized just with the lubrication cavity. I also have fluid on this side, and it kind of balances it out. Now, in the olden days, they used to oftentimes put a check ball that would vent the cavity between the piston and the drum in a condition where I'm spinning the drum at high speed to bleed the fluid out. But here we've gotten away from this. This is a little more elaborate method, but a much better method to balance that characteristic of the centrifugal force on fluid. Okay, now, what are we going to do here? Here I have my O-ring or D-type ring seals for the K2 drum. And here we have our Torlon sealing rings. 1, 2, 3. And the old ones were actually in pretty good shape, but here we get brand new ones in the kit. And this is what comes in our kit.